Eyes in the war between Ukraine and Russia. One of the most curious issues is which side will take the first step for the spring attacks. It was widely reported that Ukraine was in the final stages of preparing for a spring offensive against Russia. Success or failure, this would likely be Ukraine's last chance to launch a large-scale offensive operation for the next 6 months or more, while Ukraine continues to prepare its plans to make the right decision to use its last chance. Mariupol, the most important center for securing the corridor between Crimea and Donbass, was determined as the first stop of this offensive operation. Now, the Ukrainians had started their spring offensive, and accordingly, recently, the port of Mariupol has been shaken by very violent explosions. Heavy artillery sounds were heard in the important port city. The explosions were violent. Advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, Petro Andriaschenko, reported that as a result of the close artillery fire of the Ukrainian forces, some military resources in the city were destroyed. These attacks were not only offensive fire against the Russian forces in the city of Kadyrov, soldiers fighting for the Russian army. The Ukrainians seem to have planned this stunning operation a long time ago. The reason for this was the point-blank attacks carried out by the Ukrainian artillery on strategic military targets in the city. In Mariupol, there were not only resources belonging to the Russian troops, but also very important ammunition depots, military command centers, and many positions of Kadyrov soldiers. And even in the city, the military resources of the Chechen soldiers were much more than the Russian troops. If you remember, Chechen troops fighting for the Russian army were using Mariupol as a connecting road to reach the Donetsk front lines. Therefore, Mariupol was a center of Chechen soldiers. Explosions in the port were heard even from nearby residential areas, and even according to some sources, a military training base belonging to Kadyrov soldiers was hit as a result of heavy artillery fire by the Ukrainian forces on Mariupol. According to the first details of this striking operation, no information regarding the loss of life was shared. However, considering that the explosions were quite violent and intense, it's estimated that Chechen troops faced a great loss in these attacks that took place in the port of Mariupol. The city of Mariupol has actually been severely devastated since the beginning of the war as a result of heavy bombardment by Russian forces. Russian attacks destroyed almost 90% of the city. It's thought that more than 100,000 people currently live in Mariupol. However, it's known that this population includes military forces fighting in the city. If you remember, the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, made a secret visit to this critical city in the past weeks. And during this visit, an unidentified woman addressed the Russian leader and uttered striking sentences that everything was over in Mariupol and that what was done here was just a show. In fact, the statements of this woman caused some critical speculations to emerge. The first of these was the issue of whether the person who went to Mariupol was really Russian leader Putin. Ukrainian intelligence made striking statements on this issue that the person who visited Mariupol was actually Putin's double. But the second speculation was actually much more important because after Putin's visit to Mariupol, the Ukrainians began to circulate striking statements that he would refocus on the city and carry out violent attacks there. In fact, these statements came true, and the port of Mariupol, as we mentioned, suddenly came under Ukrainian artillery fire. Now, what kind of results will be waiting for us with the blockade of this city again by the attacks of Ukrainians? In fact, this situation seems quite risky for the Russians because, as you know, Mariupol serves as a bridge that the Chechen troops use to reach critical front lines such as Bakhmut, Volodar, and Soledar. But now that the city is under heavy bombardment, military shipments have been suspended. Russian forces do not want to risk these shipments. In addition, the Russians are suspicious of the possibility of new attacks by the Ukrainians. Therefore, it's quite unreasonable for the Russians to use the port of Mariupol at the moment or to carry out military shipments on the strategic connection roads of the city. On the other hand, Mariupol, which is one of the important gates of Ukraine to the Black Sea, draws attention with its close distance from Crimea, which Russia legally annexed from this Portuguese. The shipping time between the Donbass region and the Crimea is significantly reduced. In other words, the critical port in the city is one of the important addresses that connects to the Crimean Peninsula, which is almost one of the most important front lines of the war. For this reason, the Russians attach great importance to even the smallest attacks in the city. The fact that Mariupol is so important to the Russians, due to its critical features such as creating a bridge to the Crimea, increases the security measures there. After the artillery attacks in the port of Mariupol, the Russian authorities in the city reportedly launched a comprehensive document and mobile phone check in the city along Metallurov Boulevard in this city. Two military vehicles from the Russian army are currently patrolling almost at every intersection. Also along this street, every 200 meters, 8 Russian military and police units are constantly undertaking search missions. A large number of police patrols continue to arrive in the city of Donetsk, which is still occupied by Russian forces. A red alert was issued in the city despite so many security measures taken in Mariupol. Mysterious and striking situations still continue to occur in the city. Prior to the explosions in the city's port, the Kremlin's TASS news agency reported that there had been an assassination attempt on the so-called head of police, Mikhail Moskvin, in Mariupol. Allegedly, Moskvin's car exploded just a few meters away from him, injuring the Russian official. Moskvin was responsible for operating the filtering camps in the occupied port city, which the Russians used to hunt down pro-Ukrainian people and arrange for the deportation of others to Russia in the temporarily occupied city of Mariupol. After the car explosion of the collaborators, so-called head of police, Mikhail Moskvin, and the explosion in the city's port, the Russians almost doubled the number of patrols in all the streets of Mariupol. Most recently, although the Russians have stepped up their measures, the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian anti-war resistance groups continue to pursue their determined cause. But the Russian Guard, especially these days, is focused on looking for members of the Ukrainian resistance movement allegedly responsible for the assassination of Mikhail Moskvin. All these events and the security measures taken were actually the steps taken by the Russians against the possibility of Ukrainians forming a critical connection with Crimea. As we mentioned in the video, rather than a possible danger in Mariupol, especially in this critical time period, the connection of Ukrainian forces to the Crimean Peninsula from strategic areas such as Mariupol, Kherson, and Armyansk around the peninsula border may completely change the fate of the war. This situation may even force Russia to negotiate peace. When we evaluate the situations experienced in the territory of Ukraine from an objective point of view, it seems that the breaking moments of the war will be experienced in these important front lines. Therefore, both sides no longer have a chance to make mistakes in these regions because a single mistake can cause irreparable things. And from now on, neither Ukraine nor Russia can take this risk. Recently, we see that the Russians have had to flee from the front, from Russia and from the world, or try to hide. Actually, we see that Russian President Vladimir Putin is in a similar situation for different reasons. Confessions of Russian President Vladimir Putin's former special bodyguard show that Putin is looking for a safe place to escape or hide. What is the Russian president trying to escape from, or why is he hiding? Now, together, we will examine the issue in depth with the confessions of Putin's special bodyguard who escaped from the Russian Federal Guard service. First, let's list the reasons for the Russian president to flee or hide somewhere. And then let's take a look at the confessions of Putin's former bodyguard from the Russian Federal Guard with his striking confessions. Recently, we have seen that the people of the Russian Federation are living in anxiety, fear and panic and revolt against the Russian regime while being crushed by the heavy economic sanctions of the West. Those living in Russia also had to live with the war policies, mobilization, and constraints of the Putin regime. These situations led to the formation of a large anti-war resistance group within Russia. The Russians to leave their country, the soldiers to flee from the army or to commit suicide, sabotage to Russian military centers, mysterious explosions and fires. Confessions of one of Russia's top figures created a bombshell effect on the agenda, and all attention was suddenly focused on the statements made by this person before leaving the country. You know that since the beginning of the Ukraine war, many public officials, high-ranking military officials, and political figures in Russia left the country suddenly, especially since leader Vladimir Putin's decision to mobilize. Russia's top officials have mysteriously fled the country, leaving behind a veil of complete secrecy. And even the unexplained fires, explosions, and chaos in Russia had reached its peak. After such situations, these mysterious escapes, which also set fire to the anti-war resistance groups in Russia, have now almost turned Putin's country into a fireplace. The latest confessions of one of the top figures in the Russian intelligence agency have brought to light striking allegations about the course of the war in Ukraine and its leader, Vladimir Putin. These statements, which shocked Russia, astonished millions of people. Russian captain and senior intelligence official Gleb Karakulov, who fled Russia and currently lives in a Western country, has disclosed Putin's private life. Let's explore the most striking confessions of Karakulov, one of the top figures of the Federal Guard Service, now known as FGS or FSO, in all its facets that have emerged since the beginning of the war. Karakulov claimed that Putin ordered a bunker equipped with a secure communication line to the Russian embassy in Kazakhstan. This is the first time such a claim has been made. It is also alleged that Putin is traveling or residing on secure non-satellite trains, bunkers, and planes. The Russian security and intelligence boss fled Moscow before revealing that Putin was hiding in the bunker. Since 2009, Mr. Karakulov, an engineer at FGS, announced that he had made a firm decision to leave after realizing that he was not prepared to make a deal with his conscience while working for the Russian leader. It is known that the former head of intelligence, whose duties include providing secret communication to the president, is the highest-ranking intelligence officer ever to leave Putin's inner circle. Gleb Karakulov, 35, worked as a captain in the Federal Guard Service known as FSG or FSO, and as a bodyguard for the Russian president. An official from a NATO country who has a security background and spoke anonymously to discuss sensitive political issues said that Mr. Karakulov's departure as a senior intelligence officer was abrupt and aroused great interest. This separation will be seen as a very serious blow for the Russian president himself, because Putin is described as a leader who is extremely fond of his security. The Russian File Center, meanwhile, verified the authenticity of Mr. Karakulov's passport and FSO business ID card and compared the details of the intelligence chief's biography with Russian government records, leaked personal data, and social media posts. After all this, it was registered that the intelligence senior manager left the country completely. Yes, the top intelligence official closest to Putin had left the country, but he also left behind top secret and striking information. Let's take a look at these interesting details together. As we mentioned, Mr. Karakulov claimed that Putin became much more withdrawn, especially after the Ukraine war, and did not take his life-threatening danger out of his mind. For this reason, he drew all the attention by stating that in case of any threat, Vladimir Putin would flee from the Russian embassy in Kazakhstan to the shelter he wanted. Karakulov also admitted that the Russian leader's also mortally afraid of COVID and is now in isolation for the 4th year. Meanwhile, this defector, who is the intelligence chief, announced that all employees would need to be quarantined for 2 to 3 weeks before Putin could attend any meeting, even meetings that only lasted 15 minutes. Also, Karakulov added that even last year, Putin continued to insist on strict anti-COVID-19 measures, and FSO employees took shifts in a 2-week quarantine so that there would always be a safe pool of people allowed to travel with Putin on the train. Also, according to senior Russian intelligence official Gleb Karakulov, the Kremlin leader conducts annual medical checkups at the Central Clinical Hospital in Moscow, typically in late summer or early autumn, stating that he is in better health than his peers. Karakulov added that for over 10 years, very few official tours or engagements have been cancelled due to his health. Karakulov, on the other hand, claimed that Vladimir Putin set up identical offices in multiple locations with matching details right down to the table and wall to fool possible assassins. Gleb Karakulov also stressed that Putin's luxury mansions in St. Petersburg, Sochi, and Novo Ogaryovo also designed offices to look the same to further confuse attackers. Another tactic used by Putin was to show the addresses he was in as the same place. Proect Media has confirmed Putin's previous reports showing that his Sochi office is the same as his residence in Novo Ogaryovo, near Moscow. The Kremlin had published photos of Putin's meeting claiming that he was in Novo Ogaryovo when he was actually in Sochi. Also, Gleb Karakulov, an officer in President Vladimir Putin's secret elite personal security service who had fled to Kazakhstan, explained that the Russian autocrat became increasingly paranoid for his own safety and that he often instructed authorities to pretend to leave an area. In one related example, Karakulov admitted that while Putin was in Sochi, security guards deliberately brought a plane and sent a convoy to deceive potential assassins, pretending he was leaving. So how did Gleb Karakulov know so many facts about the Russian leader in the smallest detail? In fact, Karakulov's job was to accompany and escort the Russian leader to luxury hotels for summits, to beach resorts in Cuba, to yachts, and in a special armored train equipped for the Russian president. For this reason, the Russian senior intelligence official and Putin had to be side by side all the time. In fact, Karakulov noted that Putin's train reassembled any train painted gray with red stripes to blend in with other railroad cars in Russia. Citing a trip with a Russian leader, Karakulov stated that Putin does not like the fact that flights can be tracked, preferring the privacy of an ordinary train car. In addition, the senior Russian intelligence official also reported that Putin started using this armored train regularly before he invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Mr. Karakulov's account generally coincided with other statements that portrayed the Russian president as a once charismatic but increasingly isolated leader who insisted on accessing Russian state television. According to Karakulov, all the information Putin receives comes only from directly close people. According to him, the leader of Russia lives in a kind of information vacuum because in connection with the security issue. Gleb Karakulov also claimed that he had not seen the Russian leader even once on his mobile phone and rarely used the internet. But despite all of this, some of the data that the Russian leader tried to hide came to light in time after the Ukraine war. For example, the number of Russian soldiers who died in the war and what Russian forces originally did on Ukrainian soil. As a result, thanks to these confessions, Putin's knowledge of the outside world was filtered by the secret services with Kullervo's rhetoric and what he watched on state-controlled Russian television. All of Western analysts' suspicions that Putin might be living in a bubble without realizing how bad the invasion was were confirmed. But Russia does not accept these claims in any way. The groups that argue that more solid evidence will emerge over time, on the other hand, do not doubt the existence of the information Karakulov mentioned. There are a lot of updates from the Obama direction when it comes to the city itself. The situation is very dynamic. Yesterday, Wagner forces started to fire at the last block of the high-rise buildings from tanks and artillery in order to prepare the region for the upcoming storming operations. Some sources indicate that in order to not lose men, Ukrainians temporarily withdrew their forces to Ivanovsky. And once the artillery preparation ended, Ukrainians started reinforcing this region once again. The head of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, also reported something similar. He said that because Ukrainians unblock the flanks and are controlling tactical heights around the city, they are essentially moving freely in and out of the city. He said that for this reason, the battle for the outskirts can be characterized as an encounter battle where two forces are engaging, as both of them are trained to move into the so-called domino fortification. The situation is equally difficult for both parties. Ukrainians struggle to defend the outskirts because it is too dangerous to maintain a permanent presence there, while Russians struggle to move into the outskirts because Ukrainians control tactical heights around them. That is why Prigozhin said that they would not be able to take Bakhmut this week, and Ukrainians continued to push on the flanks. Today it was confirmed that they increased the scale of the operation once again and opened a fourth line of attack. Previously, Ukrainians were advancing from Ivanovsky, Bogdanovka and Mankivka, and today they also started advancing from Fedorivka. The target of the first attack became Russian positions around Sako and Vanzeti. Ukrainian artillery crews conducted artillery preparation in coordination with drone operators that helped to correct the fire. And after that, Ukrainians sent an assault unit reinforced with a tank to undermine Russian defense and clear the trenches after the tank had completed its job by successfully establishing a bridgehead south of the Vasylkivka River. Ukrainians are setting conditions for an attack on Sako and Vanzeti and Mykolivka, which will allow them to conveniently move along the tree lines and settlements, simultaneously opening access to the tactical heights. In fact, Ukrainians have already started undermining Russian defense in Paraskeva and Dubova Vasilivka with artillery strikes on warehouses and equipment, and drone strikes on the trenches on the zero line. And this is exactly what Prigozhin predicted 1 week ago today. He made a public appeal and very politely asked the High Command to hold Sako and Vanzeti and prevent another collapse at all costs, at least for 2 days. The reason why he is asking to hold at least this direction is that the collapsing flanks are putting significant strain on his reserves, as the Wagner group has been plugging the holes around Bakhmut, in particular in the southern direction. Today it was confirmed that Wagner units reinforced Kashyuka. In fact, both Ukrainian and Russian fighters and commanders reported that Wagner reinforcements were the only thing that prevented an immediate collapse of Klitschevak. However, a fighter from the 24th Assault Brigade specified that most of the troops on the zero line are mobilized soldiers and former prisoners. He also said that a hammer strike at the Wagner prisoner forces during the relocation and liquidated up to 30% of their reserves. Ukrainian intelligence reported that in order to stabilize the situation and prevent further collapse of the front line, Russian forces started relocating their troops from Zaporizhia to Bakhmut. The head of the Donetsk People's Republic and several military-affiliated bloggers reported that several battalions were relocated, even from Avdiivka and Marinka. This is consistent with a statement of the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister, who said that Russian forces are deploying additional airborne forces to defend Bakhmut flanks. Independent monitoring organization, the Belarusian Hedging Project, reported the deployment of about 40 pieces of military equipment and at least 200 servicemen from Belarus in the direction of Luhansk. The Ukrainian General Staff confirmed that Russian forces began to redeploy additional trained forces from Belarus. Such developments have far-reaching implications. First of all, the relocation of additional forces to Luhansk explains the consistent Ukrainian strikes on the city. In fact, yesterday Ukrainians conducted another storm shadow missile strike. The former head of the DPR militia confirmed that recent Ukrainian strikes on the military objects in Luhansk were successful. And secondly, the destabilization of the front line in the east prompted Russians to deliberately weaken their defense in the Zaporizhia region by relocating manpower away from the south. Maybe this is exactly what the Ukrainian High Command was planning to achieve.